In the summer of 1941, German boots thundered across the Soviet border with a contempt that went beyond mere military aggression. To the Nazi leadership and their followers, they weren't just invading another country. They were asserting what they believed was the natural order of the world. The Nazis had a word for the people they were attacking, Untermensch, subhuman. In their twisted racial ideology, the Slavic peoples of the Soviet Union were barely considered human at all. They were animals to be exploited, slaves to be worked to exhaustion, obstacles to be removed from the path of German expansion. This wasn't just propaganda for the masses. This was the core belief that drove every decision, every order, every unthinkable act that would unfold on the Eastern Front. The Nazi vision was clear and horrifying. According to their general plan, Ost, the master plan for the East, the Slavic population was to be reduced through systematic elimination, with survivors expelled to Siberia or used as forced labor. The Russians, Ukrainians, Poles, and other Slavic peoples were viewed as incapable of mounting any form of organized resistance against the superior German invaders. Hitler and his propaganda minister Goebbels compared them to rabbits, to stolid animals that were idle and disorganized. They spoke of a wave of filth that needed to be swept away to make room for German living space, their coveted Lebensraum. This wasn't merely racist rhetoric. It translated into policy, into action, into death on an industrial scale. When German forces rolled into Soviet territory, they carried with them orders that would have been unthinkable on the Western Front. The rules of war, such as they were, didn't apply to these people the Nazis considered less than human. Prisoners of war were left to perish from starvation and exposure. Entire villages were erased from existence. The brutality wasn't a side effect of war. It was the point. And in those first months, it seemed like the Nazi ideology might be vindicated by military success. Operation Barbarossa, launched on June 22, 1941, rolled forward with devastating speed. The Wehrmacht's blitzkrieg tactics, which had already conquered most of Western Europe, seemed unstoppable in the east. German armored columns punched deep into Soviet territory, encircling massive numbers of Red Army soldiers in enormous pocket battles. At Bialystok and Minsk, hundreds of thousands of Soviet troops were trapped and captured. At Smolensk, the pattern repeated. The Luftwaffe achieved air superiority by destroying much of the Soviet Air Force on the ground in the first days of the invasion. Millions of Soviet soldiers found themselves prisoners in German hands. The element of surprise had been total. Despite numerous warnings, Soviet leader Joseph Stalin had refused to believe that Hitler would break their non-aggression pact. When the invasion came, Soviet defenses were caught completely unprepared. Command and control broke down. Units were overrun before they could even deploy properly. The German advance seemed inexorable, a mechanized wave of conquest that validated every assumption about German military superiority. If you're finding this story as gripping as we intended, take a moment right now to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. We bring you these deep dives into military history every week, and your support helps us continue telling these incredible stories. Drop a comment too, and let us know what aspect of the Eastern Front you'd like us to cover next. The German soldiers advancing into Soviet territory in 1941 had every reason to believe their leadership's narrative. They were winning overwhelmingly. By autumn, they had penetrated hundreds of miles into the Soviet Union. Leningrad was under siege. German forces were approaching Moscow itself. The Soviet Union appeared to be on the verge of collapse, just as France had collapsed the year before, just as Poland had fallen before that. But there was something the Nazi ideology had failed to account for, something that all their racial theories and contemptuous dismissals had blinded them to. The people they called subhuman were in fact human. They could learn. They could adapt. They could endure hardship that would break other nations, and they could hate with a fury that would eventually consume their invaders. The German advance stalled before Moscow in December 1941, thrown back by a Soviet counteroffensive launched in the brutal Russian winter. It was the first major German defeat of the war, and it was a harbinger of things to come. The Wehrmacht had overextended its supply lines. German soldiers, equipped for a quick summer campaign, froze in inadequate winter uniforms. Hitler's strategic mistakes, his insistence on diverting forces to secondary objectives in Ukraine and Leningrad rather than concentrating everything on Moscow, had cost Germany its best chance at victory. But the war was far from over. 1942 saw continued German offensives driving deep into the Caucasus toward the Soviet oil fields, pushing to the Volga River at a city that bore Stalin's name, Stalingrad. And it was there, in the rubble of that shattered city, that the mythology of German invincibility finally shattered completely. The Battle of Stalingrad, from August 1942 to February 1943, became a symbol of Soviet resistance and German hubris. Hitler had ordered that the city be taken at any cost, and his soldiers paid that cost in blood. Street by street, building by building, the Soviets defended their city with ferocious determination. When the smoke cleared, an entire German army, the Sixth Army under Field Marshal Paulus, had been encircled and forced to surrender. Over 90,000 German soldiers marched into Soviet captivity. Most would never return. Stalingrad was the turning point. But it wasn't the end. The Eastern Front had become a meat grinder consuming German strength. At Kursk in July 1943, the last major German offensive in the East was smashed against prepared Soviet defenses. The Red Army had learned from its early defeats. Soviet commanders had studied German tactics and developed countermeasures. Soviet industry, relocated beyond the Urals and operating around the clock, was producing tanks, aircraft, and artillery in quantities Germany couldn't match. The correlation of forces was shifting inexorably against the Wehrmacht, and the Soviets were learning something else, something that would prove decisive. They were mastering what military theorists call the operational art, the level of warfare between tactics on the battlefield and grand strategy. They were learning how to coordinate massive offensives across multiple fronts, how to deceive their enemy about their true intentions, how to concentrate overwhelming force at the decisive point, how to exploit breakthroughs before the enemy could react. By early 1944, the strategic situation had reversed completely from those heady days of 1941. The Red Army was advancing along the entire Eastern Front, but German Army Group Center, holding the central sector of the front in Belarusia, remained a formidable force. It controlled key cities like Vitebsk, Orsha, Mogilev, and the Belarusian capital of Minsk. It was a bulge in the line, a salient jutting westward, defended by battle-hardened divisions that had been fighting since the beginning of the war. The German High Command expected the next major Soviet offensive to come farther south, in Ukraine. That's where the terrain was more suitable for the massive tank operations the Soviets favored. That's where previous Soviet offensives had concentrated. German intelligence was pointing in that direction. Acting on this assessment, Hitler ordered divisions transferred from Army Group Center to reinforce Army Group North Ukraine. Army Group Center lost 15% of its divisions, 88% of its tanks, and 33% of its heavy artillery. It was exactly what the Soviets wanted them to think. The deception operation was masterful. Soviet commanders maintained radio traffic patterns suggesting an offensive in Ukraine. They conducted visible troop movements in the south while moving their actual strike forces north under cover of darkness and strict radio silence. Dummy tanks and fake supply depots were set up in Ukraine. Genuine preparations in Belarusia were camouflaged with extraordinary care. The Soviets were planning something unprecedented in scale and ambition. The operation was codenamed Bagration, after a Georgian prince and general who had fought against Napoleon. It was fitting. Like Napoleon, Hitler had invaded Russia. Like Napoleon, he would learn that Russia could not be conquered. But the lesson would be far more devastating than anything Napoleon had experienced. 4 Soviet fronts, the equivalent of Western Army groups, were assembled for the offensive: the 1st Baltic Front and the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd Belarusian fronts. Together, they comprised 166 divisions totaling over 1.2 million troops. They had over 4,000 tanks and self-propelled guns. They had over 24,000 artillery pieces and mortars. They had over 5,000 aircraft. The concentration of force was staggering. Facing this juggernaut was German Army Group Center under Field Marshal Ernst Busch, with 38 divisions totaling approximately 800,000 men. The Germans had around 900 tanks and assault guns and about 1,600 aircraft. The Soviets had achieved roughly a 4-to-1 overall advantage in manpower. But at the planned breakthrough sectors, they would mass forces to create local superiority of 10-to-1 or even greater. The date chosen for the offensive was laden with symbolism: June 22, 1944. Exactly 3 years to the day since Operation Barbarossa had begun. 3 years since German forces had crossed the border with contempt for the subhumans they were about to conquer. 3 years since the War of Annihilation had commenced, but the offensive actually began slightly earlier, behind German lines. On the nights of June 19th and 20th, Soviet partisans, the resistance fighters operating in German-occupied territory, launched a massive coordinated operation. They attacked rail lines, bridges, and supply depots throughout the German rear area. Tens of thousands of demolition charges detonated simultaneously, severing German communications and transportation networks. The ability of German commanders to move reinforcements and supplies was crippled before the main offensive even began. German units trying to retreat would find themselves funneled into narrow corridors along roads and railways, perfect targets for Soviet aircraft and artillery. On the night of June 21st to 22nd, Soviet forces launched probing attacks along the German front line, combined with bombing raids on Wehrmacht communication centers. These were designed to further confuse German commanders about where the main blow would fall. Then, in the early morning hours of June 22nd, the storm broke. Soviet artillery opened fire along a 450-mile front with an intensity that veterans of the Eastern Front had never experienced. Thousands of guns and rocket launchers, massed wheel-to-wheel in the breakthrough sectors, poured fire onto German positions. Defensive fortifications that had been built up over months were obliterated in minutes. Bunkers collapsed. Ammunition dumps exploded. Communication trenches caved in. The earth itself seemed to heave and convulse under the bombardment. When the barrage lifted, Soviet infantry surged forward, supported by tanks and aircraft. The VVS, the Soviet Air Force, had near total control of the skies. German soldiers looking up for the Luftwaffe support they'd relied on in earlier years saw only Soviet aircraft. The German defenses, weakened by the transfer of units to Ukraine, undermanned and under-equipped, crumbled almost immediately. In the northern sector, the 1st Baltic Front smashed through the German 9th Corps, pushing it back across the Dvina River. By June 24th, the Lyrik Corps was encircled in the city of Vitebsk. The German commander requested permission to withdraw. Hitler, maintaining his characteristic inflexibility, insisted the city be held as a fortress. By the time he relented, it was too late. The city was completely surrounded. German attempts to break out failed. The garrison was destroyed. To the south, the 3rd Belarusian Front attacked the German 6th Corps, driving it backwards so rapidly that the entire German defensive line began to disintegrate. The 2nd Belarusian Front assaulted the city of Mogilev, breaking through the 1st defensive belt on the first day. When the Germans deployed their only reserve division, they were met the next day by massed Soviet tank brigades that achieved an operational breakthrough, pouring into the German rear. The speed of the Soviet advance was breathtaking. Within 5 days of the offensive's start, The Red Army had eliminated tens of thousands of German soldiers. Entire German units simply ceased to exist as organized formations. Commanders lost contact with their subordinates. Orders from higher headquarters arrived too late or not at all. The front wasn't just moving, it was evaporating. The First Belarusian Front attacked toward Bobruisk on June 24th, achieving similar results. The German fortress cities that Hitler had ordered, held at all costs, became traps for their own defenders. Unable to retreat, German garrisons were encircled and destroyed one after another. By June 30th, just 8 days into the offensive, German Army Group Center had suffered 200,000 casualties. That was more than a quarter of its strength gone in just over a week. Entire divisions had been wiped from the German order of battle. The Fourth Army alone, which had numbered 160,000 men at the start of the offensive, had lost 130,000. And the Soviets weren't slowing down. This was where Bagration demonstrated something the German High Command had never believed the subhumans capable of: operational-level thinking of the highest order. In previous Soviet offensives, logistical problems had forced halts for regrouping after initial successes. German commanders expected this pattern to repeat. They expected time to establish new defensive lines, to bring up reinforcements, to stabilize the situation. They were wrong. Soviet planners had learned their lessons. Supply dumps had been positioned well forward. Mobile repair units followed close behind the advancing tank formations. Supplies moved forward on trucks, on captured German vehicles, on horse-drawn carts, on anything that could carry ammunition and fuel. The Red Army had no intention of stopping. Soviet mobile forces, tank corps, and mechanized corps were inserted into the gaps torn in the German line. They bypassed German strongpoints, leaving them to be dealt with by following infantry, and drove deep into the German rear. Their objective wasn't just to push the Germans back. It was to encircle them, to cut them off, to annihilate them. On July 3rd, Soviet forces captured Minsk, the capital of Belarusia. The city that had been under German occupation for nearly 3 years was liberated. But the capture of Minsk had another significance. German forces east of the city were now completely cut off. Over 100,000 German soldiers found themselves trapped in a pocket east of Minsk, with Soviet forces between them and any possible escape. The encircled Germans attempted to break out, launching desperate attacks to the west. Some small groups managed to infiltrate through Soviet lines in the forests and swamps. But the vast majority were killed or captured. The Fourth Army, which had been one of the most powerful formations in Army Group Center, effectively ceased to exist. By July 5th, the remnants of the encircled forces had been eliminated. The destruction was total and unprecedented. By July 4th, total German losses had reached 400,000 personnel. Think about that number for a moment. 400,000 soldiers gone in less than 2 weeks. That's more than the total number of American combat deaths in the entire Second World War, suffered by Germany in a single operation in a span of days. German Ninth Army, obliterated. German Fourth Army, annihilated. German Third Panzer Army, shattered. The entire Army Group Center, one of the 3 main German army groups on the Eastern Front, had been destroyed as an effective fighting force. 28 of its divisions were eliminated. In German military history, which stretched back centuries through countless wars, nothing compared to this disaster. Not even the defeat at Stalingrad had been this complete, this swift, this devastating. And still, the Soviets advanced. The operational objectives had been achieved, but the Soviet High Command saw an opportunity for something even greater. If they kept pushing, they could drive into Poland, into the Baltic states, toward Germany itself. The war could potentially be ended in 1944. Soviet forces reached the Polish border on July 13th. Cities continued to fall in rapid succession. Vilnius, Grodno, Brest-Litovsk, all were liberated from German occupation. Ukrainian front forces to the south, capitalizing on the chaos in the German command structure, captured Lvov on July 27th. The entire German position in the east was unraveling. The Soviet advance only halted when it reached the limits of logistical sustainability. After advancing more than 400 miles in some sectors, having liberated virtually all of Belarusia and pushed deep into Poland and the Baltic states, Soviet forces simply ran out of supplies. Their trucks needed fuel, their tanks needed repairs, their soldiers needed rest and replacement equipment. It wasn't German resistance that stopped them. It was Soviet exhaustion and the iron laws of logistics that governed all military operations. But what they had accomplished in those 8 weeks from late June to mid-August was extraordinary. The speed of Operation Bagration exceeded even the German blitzkrieg advances of 1941. Soviet forces had advanced faster than the Wehrmacht had, when it was supposedly demonstrating the superiority of German arms and the incompetence of Soviet defenses. The human cost was staggering. German casualty figures vary depending on the source, but the generally accepted estimate is around 450,000 killed, wounded, or captured. Some sources put the figure even higher. The Soviets captured enormous quantities of equipment, over 2,000 tanks and assault guns, tens of thousands of other vehicles, vast stocks of ammunition and supplies. Soviet casualties were also heavy, as they had been throughout the Eastern Front. Estimates range from 180,000 to over 200,000 killed and wounded, but unlike the Germans, the Soviets could replace their losses. Soviet industry was producing more tanks, more aircraft, more guns. Soviet training camps were turning out more soldiers. The Soviet Union had mobilized its entire society for total war, and it had the population and resources to sustain that mobilization. Germany, by mid-1944, did not. The destruction of Army Group Center had strategic implications that reached far beyond the Eastern Front. June 6, 1944, just over 2 weeks before Bagration began, Allied forces had landed in Normandy. For the first time since the war began, Germany was fighting major offensives on 2 fronts simultaneously. Hitler's nightmare scenario had become reality, and Germany simply didn't have the forces to contain both threats. Divisions that might have been sent to France to throw the Allies back into the sea had to be diverted to the east to try to stem the Soviet tide. The German military was being pulled apart, its strategic reserve consumed in desperate attempts to plug gaps that opened faster than they could be filled. The psychological impact on the German military and the German people was equally devastating. The myth of the invincible Wehrmacht, already badly damaged at Stalingrad and Kursk, was shattered beyond repair. German soldiers knew now that they were not fighting subhumans. They were fighting an enemy that had learned to coordinate operations on a scale that Germany couldn't match, that could bring to bear resources Germany couldn't counter, that fought with a determination fueled by 3 years of brutal occupation and systematic atrocities. In Moscow on July 17th, the Soviets staged a propaganda spectacle of their own. 57,000 German prisoners of war were marched through the streets of the Soviet capital. These were some of the soldiers captured in the Minsk pocket, officers and enlisted men, paraded before Soviet citizens who had suffered 3 years of war, whose cities had been bombed, whose relatives had been killed or enslaved by these very men. The message was clear. The invaders who had come east with such arrogance were now defeated, humiliated, prisoners. The fate that awaited these prisoners was grim. Soviet prisoner of war camps were harsh places. Inadequate food, shelter, and clothing combined with forced labor led to significant loss of life among German prisoners. Soviet estimates put the number at around 380,000 German prisoners perishing throughout the war. German estimates are closer to 1 million. The exact truth lies somewhere between, but regardless, it was a terrible fate, one that perhaps seemed like justice to the Soviets who remembered how German forces had deliberately allowed millions of Soviet prisoners to perish in the war's early years. Operation Bagration continued in phases through mid-August. Follow-on operations cleared the Baltic states, pushed into Poland, and set the stage for subsequent offensives that would eventually carry Soviet forces to Berlin itself. The Wehrmacht would continue to fight, sometimes with desperate skill, but it was fighting a losing battle against arithmetic. Germany was running out of men, out of fuel, out of time. The Eastern Front had become the engine of Germany's destruction. Roughly 80% of all German military casualties in World War II occurred fighting the Soviet Union. This wasn't the sideshow while the real war was fought in the West. This was the real war. Normandy, Italy, North Africa, all were important, but the main event was always in the East. And the ideology that had started it all, the racial theories that had labeled Slavic peoples as subhuman, had proven to be not just morally bankrupt, but strategically catastrophic. The Nazis had launched a war of annihilation based on the assumption that their racial enemies were inferior and incapable of effective resistance. That assumption had led them to brutalize the very populations that might have welcomed them as liberators from Soviet rule. It had led them to underestimate their enemies' capacity to learn and adapt. It had blinded them to the reality that human beings, regardless of their ethnicity, are capable of extraordinary determination when fighting for their survival. The speed of Operation Bagration wasn't just a military achievement. It was a repudiation of everything the Nazi ideology claimed. The subhumans had proven themselves more capable than the supposed master race. The disorganized, idle animals that Nazi propaganda had mocked had coordinated a military operation of breathtaking complexity. The inferior Slavic race had demonstrated operational art at a level the Germans couldn't match. There's a bitter irony in the timing. 3 years, almost to the day, from the moment German forces crossed the Soviet border with contempt and confidence, Soviet forces were rolling westward over the shattered remnants of German Army Group Center. 3 years from Barbarossa to Bagration, 3 years from the Wehrmacht at the height of its power to the Wehrmacht in catastrophic defeat. 3 years from German soldiers advancing with the certainty of racial superiority to German soldiers retreating in terror from an enemy they'd been taught to despise. The architects of Operation Bagration, commanders like Konstantin Rokossovsky, Ivan Cherniakovsky, and Ivan Bagramian, had learned their trade in the hard school of defeat. Many Soviet commanders in 1941 had been executed or disgraced for their failures. But some had survived, had learned, had studied their mistakes and their enemies' methods. By 1944, they had become masters of their craft, capable of operations that combined deception, concentration of force, and exploitation with a skill that equaled or exceeded anything in the German playbook. The Soviet soldiers advancing in Operation Bagration were different from those who had retreated in panic in 1941. They were better trained, better equipped, better led. They'd learned that German tanks could be destroyed, that German soldiers could be beaten, that the Wehrmacht was not invincible. And they advanced not just to reclaim their territory, but with a fury born of 3 years of occupation, of seeing what the Nazis had done to their cities and villages, to their fellow citizens. The scale of what happened in those summer weeks of 1944 is difficult to fully comprehend. We talk about 450,000 German casualties as a statistic, but each one of those was a human being. Some were committed Nazis who believed in the ideology of racial superiority. Many were ordinary soldiers conscripted into a war they might not have chosen. All of them learned in the forests and swamps of Belarusia that the people they'd been told were subhuman were in fact entirely capable of defeating them. The civilian population of Belarusia paid a horrific price for the liberation. The Nazis, following their scorched earth policy, destroyed whatever they could as they retreated. Cities were burned, Civilians were driven from their homes. Those suspected of aiding the partisans faced brutal retaliation. By the time Operation Bagration concluded, Belarusia had suffered proportionally more than perhaps any other region in the entire war. Over 2 million of its people, roughly a quarter of the pre-war population, had perished. In the broader context of World War II, Operation Bagration was the moment when the outcome of the war in Europe became inevitable. Germany would fight on for another 10 months, but it was fighting not to win, but merely to delay defeat. The destruction of Army Group Center eliminated any possibility of Germany stabilizing the Eastern Front. From Bagration forward, it was only a question of when, not if, Soviet forces would reach Berlin. The operation also demonstrated that the Soviet Union had become a military superpower. The Red Army of 1944 bore little resemblance to the force that had stumbled through the Winter War against Finland in 1939. It had been forged in the crucible of the Eastern Front into an instrument capable of crushing even the most formidable opposition. This was the military force that would dominate Eastern Europe for the next 45 years. That would be America's primary adversary in the Cold War. Operation Bagration was the announcement of its arrival on the world stage. For Germany, Bagration was the beginning of the end. The strategic situation in July 1944 was hopeless. The Allies were breaking out of Normandy. Soviet forces were driving into Poland. Italy had already surrendered, and German forces there were being pushed north. German cities were being pounded into rubble by Allied bombing raids. The submarine campaign in the Atlantic had been defeated. Germany's allies were abandoning the sinking ship. Finland would sign an armistice in September. Romania would switch sides in August. Bulgaria would be occupied by Soviet forces. Hungary would try to negotiate a separate peace, leading to German occupation. And yet the war would continue. Hitler refused to consider surrender, insisting that some miracle would save Germany even as the Reich's territory shrank day by day. German soldiers continued to fight, some out of loyalty, some out of fear of Soviet retribution for what Germany had done in the East, some simply because they didn't know what else to do. The final months of the war in Europe would see some of the most vicious fighting of the entire conflict. But the outcome had been determined in those summer weeks when Soviet forces tore through Army Group Center like a scythe through wheat. The subhumans had spoken, and their answer to 3 years of occupation, of brutality, of genocide, was Operation Bagration. It was an answer delivered in the language of artillery barrages, tank advances, and encircled armies. It was an answer that said, with overwhelming force, that the Nazi racial ideology was not just morally evil, but factually wrong. The soldiers of the Red Army who fought in Operation Bagration would continue westward. They would fight through Poland, through East Prussia, through the approaches to Berlin. Many wouldn't survive to see victory, but in June and July of 1944, they had demonstrated something that would echo through history. They had shown that human beings cannot be reduced to categories of superior and inferior based on their ethnicity. They had shown that the outcome of wars is determined not by racial mythology, but by strategy, logistics, determination, and sacrifice. They had shown that the people the Nazis called subhuman were capable of feats of arms that the supposedly superior master race could neither anticipate nor withstand. 3 years and 1 day after Operation Barbarossa began with German confidence in their racial superiority and their inevitable victory, Operation Bagration ended with the complete destruction of German Army Group Center and Soviet forces poised to carry the war into the heart of Germany. The speed of that Soviet advance, covering in weeks what had taken the Germans months in 1941, told the final story. The subhumans had not only survived, they had prevailed. And in prevailing, they had proven that the entire edifice of Nazi racial ideology was built on a foundation of lies. History would remember Operation Bagration as one of the most complete military victories ever achieved. Military historians would study it as a masterpiece of operational art, but perhaps its greatest significance was simpler and more profound. It was the moment when the people the Nazis had dismissed as inferior demonstrated, beyond any shadow of doubt, that human worth cannot be determined by race, and that evil ideologies, no matter how confidently asserted, will ultimately collide with reality and shatter upon it.